Chapter 2. Sergeant Wildboar. As I turn from the window, my gaze falls on my old Dutch clock, which stands on the shelf above the table where I eat. The case is made of oak and has a richly ornamented pediment, a brass face, and a pendulum that swings visibly to and fro. The clock is more than 200 years old, and it has been in my possession for a long time. It was given to me by Dr. Thomas M. Fehen, who was the director of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich until his death in 1996. The clock had once been owned by one William Wildboar. Sergeant Wildboar was transferred to a penal colony on Melville Island, where he remained only a short time before, through a great stroke of luck, finding himself relieved of all his duties. This meant that he now could devote himself without interruption to his work on the various choirs which lay arrayed around him in his narrow office, day in and day out. Squatting like a surgeon over the bodies of those immortals, he would from time to time feel as if he really were busy gutting a catch, all the while quietly humming a melody of no known provenance, which, even if the whole of the rest of the world had been accidentally extinguished, would have continued nevertheless in the silence of his depraved mind to the end of time. On any given evening, as darkness fell, and sometimes from breakfast onwards, Sergeant Wildboar, dressed now as the fabulous Peter the Great, now with a turban and a scimitar of enormous size, would make his way from mess to mess, carrying with him from the arm chest in his office innumerable sheets of paper, continually adding to the series of grotesqueries that had long since gone beyond all limits of decency. He began, it will be remembered, with such charmingly odd character sketches as those of Mr. Swales or of his present commanding officer, Lieutenant Basil de Selincourt, without difficulty evoking a smile of recognition in his fellow men. Then, however, incited as he was by the sole motive of self-extermination, he began to overstep the boundaries of decency, and in his sprouting imagination the masts of sail torn asunder and floating away in space. The hideous tropical silence, which some of the petrified moments into which his memory had condensed represented to him, the wearying impotence constantly gnawing at the sinews of the white whalers, put a wholly new image before his eyes. The vile orgies of his comrades, who now plunged downwards into the abyss of insanity, each one as he found himself sinking, sucked further down by the rest of them, who clung together like shipwrecked mariners, and festering ulcers broke out all over the body of their ship. By the time Sergeant Wildboar was brought to the Naval Hospital in Devonport, he had covered thousands of pages with the swarming, mocking hordes of his weird fancy. His final designs, representing the S and the S of the penal codes, overgrown in his mind into veritable jungles, were thickened at the edges by all manner of white worms, which bore the top halves of Selincourt and of the captain of the foretop, and of the captain of the foretop, and the lower halves of a large number of constipated or foam-flecked dogs he knew, or had once glimpsed here and there on the streets. Here and there, gauze like strands ran between the initials of these skulkers or mongrels. Now, Sergeant Wildboar lingered several months in the Naval Hospital in Devonport, making a series of wild and unsuccessful attempts to find some remedy to heal his distressed mind. After nearly 2 years at last, in one February or other, he fell prey to the ague in his head, which discharged him from all his duties just as he had hoped. And on the 12th of March 1831, when he was hardly 30 years old, he was already 6 feet under. I was reminded of the story of Sergeant Wildboar by a passage in the memoirs of the whaling captain George Comer, who was born in 1858 in Quebec, but whose family moved to East Haddam, Connecticut, and who, in the course of a long and adventurous life, made no fewer than 14 voyages to the icy waters of the Arctic. In his memoirs, Kommer relates how, on his first whaling voyage, which lasted from 1873 to 1876, he was taken ill with a fever on the island of Melville, where he was saved from death only by the care of a certain Sergeant Wildboar, who was then the sole representative of the law in that desolate place. Kommer describes Melville Island as a kind of penal colony, the most remote of all such establishments, where the most hardened of criminals were sent from the mainland, and where, as a result, the most appalling acts of depravity were committed. The convicts on Melville Island, writes Kommer, were not of the ordinary kind, but were people who, in their own way, had been driven to the very edge. They were, for the most part, men who had been condemned to a long term of imprisonment, or even to life, for the most trifling of misdemeanors. In the early days of the colony, the convicts were put to work on the construction of the prison buildings, on the cultivation of the land, and on the building of a breakwater. But as time went by, and as the numbers of prisoners grew, the work became ever more arduous, and the convicts, who had no prospect of ever being released, began to lose all hope. They were beaten and maltreated by the guards and by their fellow prisoners, and the more they were maltreated, the less they were able to work. It was a vicious circle, and it was in the nature of things that the convicts would try to break out of it. Kommer writes that in the summer of 1873, when he arrived on Melville Island, there were only 3 guards left to keep watch on the 1,200 prisoners, and that the convicts, who had been promised a better life in the new country, were in a state of mutiny. They had already set fire to the prison workshops and were planning to do the same to the prison buildings and then to escape to the mainland in the chaos that ensued. But the convicts, who were for the most part illiterate, had no idea of what was involved in such an undertaking, and they had no notion of the extent of the wilderness that lay between them and the next settlement. The guards, on the other hand, were well aware of the dangers that would confront the escapees, and they were determined to prevent the mutiny from breaking out. Kommer writes that the situation was so tense that the guards were ordered to shoot any prisoner who tried to escape on the spot. It was at this time, when the prisoners were being driven to the very edge, that Sergeant Wildboar, who had been sent to Melville Island to restore order, came into contact with Kommer, who was lying gravely ill in the prison hospital. Kommer writes that Sergeant Wildboar was a man of great intelligence, that he was familiar with the law, and that he was a man of great humanity. He was a man who, as Kommer writes, was at home in the world of ideas, and who, in his own way, was driven to the very edge. The fever from which Kommer was suffering when he was in the Melville Island hospital had broken out in him on the very day when, in the course of a punitive expedition, a guard had been killed by a stone thrown by one of the prisoners. Kommer had been on the point of setting sail with the whaling ship Black Eagle, which was to have taken him to the mainland. But now he was in a high fever, and his life was in danger. Sergeant Wildboar, who had taken charge of the hospital, was the only person who had any understanding of the nature of Kommer's illness, and he was the only person who took any interest in the young man from Quebec. He would sit by Kommer's bedside for hours on end, and he would talk to him about his own life, about his time as a midshipman on the frigate Lively, and about his journey to the island of Melville, which had been a kind of punishment for him. Kommer writes that he was deeply moved by the tale told by Sergeant Wildboar, and that he would often think of him in the years that followed. He writes that he was particularly struck by the account of the voyage to Melville, which was made on a convict ship, and by the terrible conditions on board. The ship was so overcrowded that the convicts had no opportunity to move from one side of the deck to the other, and they had to relieve themselves where they stood. The stench was indescribable, and the heat was unbearable. The convicts had to sleep in chains, and they were given nothing to eat but moldy biscuits and rancid water. They were so weak that they could hardly stand, and they were constantly tormented by fever and by the lice that were crawling all over them. In the course of the conversation, Sergeant Wildboar was now in the habit of holding with him every day. Cummer also learned how Sergeant Wildboar had been stationed in the hospital in Devonport at the end of his tormented life, now under the guidance of a Dr. Wintle, who was a particular friend of the poet laureate Robert Southey. He had begun to draw ships with which he, who had never previously shown any artistic talent, was from that time forward wholly preoccupied. During the last weeks of his life, and although he was then barely able to hold a pencil, he had drawn a picture which, he believed, showed his own convict ship crossing the equator on its way to the other hemisphere. This picture, writes Comer, was hanging on the wall above his bed. It showed a tiny, frail little vessel, black in the greenish light, with the convicts who were being transported on her crowded together on deck, where a man in a turban, identified by Sergeant Wildboar as himself, was standing far away from all the others in despair. Comer was so deeply affected by the account given by Sergeant Wildboar that he promised him, as he lay dying, that he would take the picture hanging above his bed to the orphanage where he had himself spent his childhood, and in which Sergeant Wildboar had been put when he was a boy of 7 for the crime of stealing a loaf of bread.